In the isolated valleys of Appalachia, far from the eyes of civilization, dark stories of families forgotten by time are buried like secrets that no one dares to unearth. This is the story of Elijah Blackwood, the most disturbing patriarch of West Virginia, a man who married two 16-year-old nieces. His legacy of perversion and control transformed generations of a family into victims of their own corrupted bloodlines. Between 1927 and 1978, one of the most disturbing family dynasties ever documented in the region developed in the rugged mountains of West Virginia. Elijah Blackwood, born in 1897 in a small, isolated valley in McDowell County, grew up in a world apart where geographic isolation shaped not only the way of life but also the relationships between the few families that inhabited the region. The Appalachian Mountains have always been known for harboring isolated communities. In the early 20th century, many of these communities lived virtually without contact with the outside world. Roads were precarious or non-existent, and families depended only on themselves to survive. In this context of extreme isolation, marriage patterns that would be considered taboo elsewhere sometimes became a silent reality. Elijah was the oldest of 8 siblings. His father, Thomas Blackwood, was known in the region for his domineering personality and the severe methods with which he raised his children. Thomas's second cousin, Sarah, was Elijah's mother, an arrangement that was not uncommon in those isolated communities of the time. The family lived off subsistence farming and hunting, rarely descending to the larger towns in the valley. When Elijah turned 18 in 1915, his father sent him to work in the coal mines that were beginning to develop in the region. This was his first real contact with the world beyond the isolated valley where he had grown up. There, among the miners, Elijah was exposed to different people and ideas, but he also developed a feeling of superiority over outsiders. He believed that his family lineage was pure and that people from outside were inferior. After 3 years working in the mines, Elijah returned to the valley in 1918 after suffering an accident that left a deep scar on his face. The isolation after the accident only intensified his controlling tendencies. When his father died in 1923, Elijah, then 26 years old, assumed the role of family patriarch. It was during this period that Elijah's behavior began to show worrying signs. He exercised absolute control over his younger siblings, especially over his sisters Margaret and Eleanor. In 1925, he arranged the marriage of Margaret, then 22, to Jeremiah Tucker, a man 15 years older, who lived on a neighboring property. The condition imposed by Elijah for the marriage was that the couple would remain living on Blackwood land under his supervision. The following year, 1926, Eleanor was also forced to marry, this time to Robert Harris, a distant cousin. Again, Elijah insisted that the couple live under his roof. Thus began to form what would later be known as the Blackwood Compound, a small cluster of cabins and structures where Elijah kept the entire family under his domain. Between 1927 and 1930, Margaret gave birth to 3 daughters, Ruth, Hannah, and Abigail. Eleanor, in turn, had 2 daughters, Esther and Mary. Elijah showed a disturbing interest in his nieces, frequently interfering in how they were raised and imposing strict rules for their education. At the time, the geographic isolation of communities like the Blackwoods meant that there was little or no external interference. Schools were too distant to be regularly attended, and authorities rarely visited these remote corners. This isolation allowed Elijah to consolidate his power over the family without external questioning. As the girls grew up, Elijah increasingly restricted their contact with the outside world. They did not attend school and were educated at home, mainly by their mothers and by Elijah himself, who taught them a distorted version of family history and the virtues of keeping the bloodline pure. It was in 1943 when Ruth and Esther turned 16 that Elijah's truly disturbing behavior came to light. That year, the husbands of his sisters, Jeremiah and Robert, died under suspicious circumstances, Jeremiah in an accident during a hunt and Robert after a sudden illness. Although there were no formal investigations at the time due to isolation, later accounts from younger family members would suggest that the deaths were planned by Elijah. With his sisters widowed and completely dependent on him, Elijah announced that he would marry Ruth, his niece, and Margaret's daughter. The marriage took place in a private ceremony held at the compound itself. Without official registration or the presence of recognized religious authorities, Margaret, dominated by her brother for years and fearing for her own safety, was unable to oppose. Just 3 months later, in an even more shocking display of depravity, Elijah declared that he would also marry Esther, Eleanor's daughter, and his other 16-year-old niece. This second marriage occurred in the same clandestine manner as the first. It's important to understand the historical context. In the 1940s, although consanguineous marriages were legally prohibited in West Virginia, authorities rarely monitored isolated communities. The state had prohibited marriages between uncles and nieces since its founding. But in remote regions where civil records were rarely kept, such laws had little practical effect. In the following years, Ruth gave birth to 4 of Elijah's children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Esther had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. It was in the first generation of children from these incestuous relationships that the genetic effects of consanguinity began to manifest in an evident way. Of the 7 children born from these relationships, 5 had significant health problems. 3 had visible physical deformities, including fused fingers, syndactyly, problems in the spine, and facial malformations. 2 others manifested what was described at the time as mental disability, now recognized as significant intellectual disability. In the 1950s, the isolation of the Blackwood Compound began to gradually decrease as road construction advanced through the region. In 1952, an itinerant doctor who visited remote communities to offer basic health care found the Blackwood family. Horrified by the conditions he witnessed, especially the state of the children, he tried to alert the authorities. However, at that time, government intervention in family matters was much more limited than it is today. Additionally, mountain families were known for their distrust of outsiders and authorities. When county officials finally visited the compound, Elijah presented falsified documents claiming that Ruth and Esther were actually his wives from neighboring communities not related to him by blood. The women, terrorized by years of abuse and manipulation, confirmed his version. The initial investigation was archived, but the case caught the attention of Dr. Charles Montgomery, a physician with a growing interest in the emerging field of genetics. In 1954, Dr. Montgomery managed to obtain permission to examine some of the compound's children, supposedly as part of a rural health program. In his notes, which would only be discovered decades later, Montgomery carefully documented the health problems observed in the Blackwood children. He noted the high incidence of congenital deficiencies and correctly suspected they were the result of close consanguinity. At that time, although understanding about genetics was still limited compared to current standards, it was already well established that consanguineous relationships increased the risk of recessive diseases. Montgomery wrote, "The patterns of anomalies observed in the Blackwood children are consistent with what the scientific literature describes as the result of close consanguinity. The incidence of physical malformations and cognitive impairment is significantly higher than would be expected in a general population. It is alarming to think about the conditions that may have led to such a situation in this isolated family." Despite his suspicions, Montgomery faced resistance from both the family and local authorities. In rural Appalachian communities in the 1950s, family matters were considered strictly private and there was a cultural reluctance to interfere even in the face of evidence of abuse or illicit behavior. Meanwhile, inside the compound, the situation deteriorated. Between 1955 and 1960, 5 more children were born from Elijah's relationship with his nieces. Of these, 3 died before completing 1 year of age, suffering from multiple health complications. Infant deaths were not uncommon in impoverished rural regions at the time, so they did not raise immediate suspicions. A turning point occurred in 1962 when Hannah, Margaret's second daughter and Ruth's sister, managed to escape from the compound at age 33. Having lived under Elijah's tyrannical domain her entire life, Hannah finally found the courage to flee. After witnessing years of abuse, she made an arduous 3-day journey through the mountains until reaching the town of Welch, where she reported her story to local authorities. Initially, her account was received with skepticism. Hannah, having lived isolated her entire life, had communication difficulties and little understanding of the world outside the compound. Additionally, her accusations were so serious that many local officials considered them fanciful or exaggerated. It was only when Thomas Ricks, a young social worker newly arrived at the County Social Services Department, decided to investigate the case more thoroughly that authorities began to take the allegations seriously. Ricks, not being bound by old networks of influence and the code of silence that sometimes characterize small rural communities, was determined to discover the truth. In October 1962, Ricks organized an official visit to the Blackwood Compound accompanied by 2 state police officers. What they found was deeply disturbing. The compound had grown to include 6 main structures housing about 30 people, all under the control of Elijah, then 65 years old. The living conditions were deplorable. The children, many with evident health problems and deficiencies, lived in conditions of extreme poverty and neglect. Some of the teenagers and young adults, children of Elijah's relationship with Ruth and Esther, showed clear signs of consanguinity, including distinctive facial features, such as receding jaws, prominent foreheads, and closely set eyes. More alarming still, Ricks discovered evidence that Elijah had begun to initiate relationships with some of his own daughters, his grandnieces, perpetuating the cycle of abuse and incest. Faced with the evidence, the authorities finally acted. Elijah was arrested along with 2 of his older sons who had become his accomplices in controlling the family. The women and children were removed from the compound and taken for medical and psychological evaluation. The court case that followed in 1963 was unprecedented for the time and region. Elijah faced multiple charges, including child abuse, illegal confinement, and incest. During the trial, which was held behind closed doors due to the sensitive nature of the accusations, disturbing details emerged about how Elijah had maintained control over the family. For decades, he had created an almost religious belief system, convincing family members that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that only by following his rules could they remain pure and safe. Physical isolation combined with psychological manipulation had allowed his regime of terror to persist for generations. Medical experts who testified at the trial presented evidence of the physical and psychological effects of prolonged incest in the family. Dr. William Patterson, a geneticist from the University of Virginia who examined several of the children, explained to the court, "What we observe in the younger members of the Blackwood family is consistent with the phenomenon known as inbreeding depression, the manifestation of harmful recessive genetic characteristics due to crossing between closely related individuals." Patterson continued, "In normal populations, harmful recessive genes rarely cause problems because the person usually has only one copy of the defective gene, compensated by a healthy copy from the other parent. However, when close relatives have children, the probability of a child inheriting 2 copies of the same harmful recessive gene increases dramatically." The evidence presented included high rates of infant mortality among Elijah's descendants, approximately 40% compared to the national average at the time of about 2%. A significantly elevated incidence of congenital malformations, including heart defects, cleft palate, and skeletal abnormalities, was documented. Widespread intellectual disability was found, with nearly 70% of living children presenting some degree of cognitive impairment. Severe immunological problems made the children extremely susceptible to infections. Reduced stature and delayed physical development were observed in almost all descendants. A particularly disturbing aspect revealed during the trial was the so-called founder effect that had occurred in the Blackwood lineage. This genetic phenomenon happens when a new population is established by a very small number of individuals from a larger population, resulting in reduced genetic diversity. In the case of the Blackwoods, with generations of consanguineous marriages, certain rare recessive genetic traits had become common in the family. A notable example was a rare form of polydactyly, extra fingers, combined with syndactyly, fused fingers, creating a distinctive malformation of the hands that affected almost 30% of the children born in the compound. Elijah Blackwood was found guilty of all charges in December 1963 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Moundsville State Prison in 1978 at 81 years of age, apparently never showing remorse for his actions. The fate of the victims was varied. The adult women, including Ruth and Esther, then 36 years old, faced enormous challenges adapting to life outside the compound. Having been subjugated and manipulated their entire lives, many struggled with mental health problems, including what would today be diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The younger children were placed in foster homes or, in the most severe cases of disabilities, in specialized care institutions. Follow-up records show that even those without evident physical deformities often developed health problems related to consanguinity later in life, including reduced fertility, autoimmune diseases, and rare metabolic disorders. In 1970, 7 years after the trial, a longitudinal study was initiated by West Virginia University to follow the survivors of the Blackwood family. This study, which would continue until 1985, provided some of the first systematic data on the long-term effects of prolonged consanguinity in a human population. Among the most significant findings was the persistence of genetic problems, even in individuals who appeared to be physically normal. Many of the survivors who did not present visible anomalies still carried multiple recessive genetic mutations that could affect their own children if they married people who by chance carried the same recessive genes. The study also documented the surprisingly high prevalence of certain rare disorders among the Blackwood descendants. For example, Usher syndrome type 2, a genetic condition that causes deafness and progressive blindness, was identified in 8 individuals in the family, a rate hundreds of times higher than in the general population. Another revealing aspect was the pattern of neurological development. Even children who did not present significant intellectual disability often demonstrated atypical patterns of cognitive development, including specific difficulties with abstract reasoning, spatial processing, and executive functions. These findings contributed to the emerging understanding of the complexity of neurological development and its genetic foundation. The legacy of the Blackwood case extends beyond the direct consequences for the family. It had a lasting impact on child protection policies in West Virginia and other states. The case was repeatedly cited during the 1970s in legislative debates about the need to strengthen child protection laws and intervention mechanisms in abusive families. In 1974, when the U.S. Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, creating the first federal program specifically aimed at child protection, the Blackwood case was mentioned as an extreme example of how isolation and lack of external supervision can allow abuse to continue for generations. From a scientific perspective, the case provided valuable data for the emerging field of behavioral genetics. Although research ethics today prohibits similar studies, the data collected from the Blackwood survivors, always with appropriate consent, helped clarify the complex interaction between genetics and environment in human development. For example, among the Blackwood siblings raised in different foster homes, those who received early and intensive educational intervention often significantly exceeded initial expectations based on their genetic profile, demonstrating the important influence of the environment on development, even in the face of significant genetic predispositions. A less discussed aspect of the case is its impact on the Appalachian communities themselves. For decades, the Blackwood story was used sensationally by the media to reinforce negative stereotypes about mountain inhabitants as inbred hillbillies. This unfair characterization obscured the complex social and economic realities affecting the region. In fact, later demographic studies demonstrated that the rates of consanguineous marriages in Appalachia were not significantly different from those of other rural American regions during the same historical period. What made the Blackwood case exceptional was not the cultural context, but rather the extreme and deliberate nature of the abuse perpetrated by a deeply disturbed individual. In 1982, a PBS documentary titled The Children of the Shadows revisited the case, interviewing some of the adult survivors who consented to share their stories. The documentary was groundbreaking for the time for its sensitive treatment of such a delicate subject and for giving voice to the victims themselves. One of the most impactful interviewees was Sarah, daughter of Ruth and Elijah, who was 12 years old when the compound was discovered. Then 31, Sarah had overcome tremendous adversities. Despite being born with a spinal malformation that left her with limited mobility and facing significant learning challenges, she had completed high school and become an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. In the documentary, Sarah reflected, "People often ask me if I hate my father. The truth is that I barely remember him as a person. He was more like a dark force that hovered over all of us. What I really feel is sadness. Sadness for what could have been. Sadness for the lives that were ruined before they even began. Another survivor interviewed was Michael, son of Esther and Elijah, who was 8 years old when he was rescued. Unlike many of his siblings and cousins, Michael did not present serious physical anomalies. Although he suffered from a rare blood disease that required continuous treatment, he spoke openly about the challenges of building a normal identity after growing up in such extraordinary circumstances. For years, I didn't tell anyone about my past. I was ashamed, as if somehow it was my fault. It was only when I started working with a therapist in college that I realized that I was a victim, not someone who should feel ashamed. Understanding the science behind what happened to our family also helped. Knowing that the health problems we face have a rational explanation, not some kind of curse, as Elijah made us believe. The psychological impact on the survivors was as profound as the physical consequences. Many struggled with issues of identity, self-esteem, and the ability to form healthy relationships. Those who eventually had their own children often described intense feelings of anxiety about the health of their descendants, even when marrying genetically unrelated partners. Emily, one of the few daughters of Elijah who managed to lead a relatively normal life and have her own family, described in the documentary the terror she felt during her pregnancy. Each prenatal exam was torture. I was convinced that something would be wrong, that somehow my father's sins would be visited upon my innocent child. When my daughter was born perfectly healthy, I couldn't stop crying with relief. The Blackwood story also raised important questions about how societies deal with survivors of extreme traumatic situations. In the years immediately following the discovery of the compound, the institutional response was fragmented and often inadequate. Many of the children were separated not only from their abusive parents but also from siblings and other relatives who could have provided some sense of continuity and connection. This separation, although well-intentioned, often added more trauma to lives already devastated. It was only in the 1970s, with the development of more holistic approaches to caring for traumatized children, that social services began to recognize the importance of preserving ties between siblings and providing specialized therapy for victims of family abuse. In 1978, the same year as Elijah's death in prison, a group of adult Blackwood survivors formed an informal support group that would later become the New Roots Foundation. This nonprofit organization, still active today, works to educate the public about child abuse and consanguinity, as well as providing support to individuals born in similar situations. A particularly notable aspect of the foundation is its work with medical and social service communities to increase awareness about the specific health needs of people with a history of family consanguinity. They have developed educational materials that help health professionals identify rare conditions that may be more common in this population, allowing for earlier and more effective interventions. In 1985, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a geneticist who worked extensively with the Blackwood survivors, published an influential study in the journal Medical Genetics that helped clarify some of the specific mechanisms by which prolonged consanguinity affects human health. The study identified more than 30 rare genetic conditions present in the Blackwood family, many of which were virtually unknown in the general population. Jenkins observed, "What makes the Blackwood case scientifically significant is not just the extent of consanguinity, but also its directed nature over multiple generations." Unlike isolated communities where cousin marriages occur out of demographic necessity, in this case, there was a deliberate selection for extremely close relationships, creating a tragically revealing natural experiment on the effects of inbreeding in humans. Among the most surprising discoveries was the identification of a previously unknown genetic variant that affected vitamin D metabolism, contributing to the high rates of rickets and other skeletal deformities observed in Blackwood children. This discovery later led to advances in the treatment of certain rare forms of vitamin D-resistant rickets. As the 1980s progressed and the younger survivors reached adulthood, new challenges emerged. Many faced difficult decisions about whether they should have their own children given their complex genetic history. Some chose not to have biological children, while others sought extensive genetic counseling and prenatal testing, an area of medicine that was just beginning to develop at the time. In 1992, almost 30 years after the initial discovery of the compound, a remarkable reunion occurred. 17 adult Blackwood survivors, many of whom had not seen each other since childhood, gathered in Charleston, West Virginia, to share their stories and celebrate their journeys of recovery. The event, organized by the New Roots Foundation, was closed to the public and media, providing a safe space for reconnection and healing. One participant, who chose to remain anonymous, later described the experience. "It was like finding pieces of a puzzle that I didn't even know were missing. Looking into the faces of people who shared not only my blood but also my experiences. It was overwhelming but also incredibly healing. For the first time, I was in a room full of people who truly understood." The legacy of the Blackwood case continues to reverberate across multiple fields. In medical genetics, the data collected over decades of following the survivors contributed to our understanding of how recessive genes interact and express themselves. In the field of child protection services, the case remains a powerful study on the dangers of extreme isolation and the need for community vigilance. For the inhabitants of Appalachia, the story serves as a reminder of the resilience needed to overcome not only the adversities imposed by poverty and geographic isolation, but also the weight of negative stereotypes that have long affected the region. Perhaps the most important legacy, however, comes from the survivors themselves. Many of them transformed their traumatic experiences into strength to help others. Some became social workers, nurses, teachers, and advocates, using their first-hand knowledge of trauma and recovery to create positive change. As Rebecca, one of Elijah's granddaughters who became a child psychologist, expressed, "For a long time, our family was defined by the darkness my grandfather created. But that's not our complete story. We are also defined by our survival, by our refusal to allow the past to determine our future. Each time I use my experience to help a traumatized child find hope, I feel like I'm rewriting a bit of that history." In 1998, when the last formal follow-up study of the Blackwood survivors was completed, the researchers noted something remarkable. Despite the tremendous genetic and psychological adversities, a surprising proportion of the survivors had managed to build stable and, in many cases, extraordinary lives. This unexpected resilience challenged many of the initial assumptions about the prognosis for children born in such extreme circumstances. The final report concluded, "Perhaps the most important lesson from the Blackwood case is not about the consequences of consanguinity, but about the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most traumatic origins when provided adequate support and opportunity." The case of Elijah Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing documented examples of family abuse and manipulation in the United States. It is a dark story of how isolation combined with the domineering personality of an individual can create generations of suffering. But it is also, finally, a story about the possibility of healing and redemption even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the words of one of the survivors, Elijah believed he was creating a dynasty that would last forever with him as the supreme ruler. Instead, his legacy is to serve as a warning to the world about the dangers of unchecked power and unsupervised isolation. If there is anything positive that emerged from this horror, it is the determination of so many of us to ensure that nothing similar happens again. Today, the mountains of West Virginia are very different from what they were in the days of Elijah Blackwood. Roads reach the most remote valleys. The internet connects even the most isolated communities to the outside world, and child protection systems are much more vigilant. However, the Blackwood story remains as a powerful reminder that the most terrible abuses can occur not only in dark alleys of cities, but also under the open sky of the mountains, where silence and isolation can hide the most disturbing human truths.